In this lecture, we're going to start storing the enemy IDs in a list. Before we can start deleting enemies, we're going to need a complete list of enemies from the current scene. Storing the enemies' IDs will be helpful in destroying specific enemies. To get started, open the Game Manager class. This component is responsible for saving the game's data. I think this is the best place for saving the enemies defeated in the game. First, we're going to need two namespaces. First, add the system.collections.generic namespace. This namespace gives us access to C# lists. Afterward, add the rpg.utility namespace. We're going to be selecting enemies from the scene by their tags. For convenience, we should use our constants to help us perform the selection. Let's create a variable for storing the enemy IDs. At the top of the class, define a variable called SceneEnemyIDs. The type will be the list class with the string type as the generic. Our IDs are stored as strings, hence why we're using the string type. Let's set the variable to a new instance of the list class. Now that we have a list for storing the IDs, we can begin searching for enemies in the scene. Below the variables, define the start method. We're going to begin selecting enemies after the game starts. In this method, create a list called SceneEnemies. The generic will be the GameObject class. Since we're selecting enemies, we must store a list of game objects. The value for this variable will be a new instance of the list class with the GameObject class as the generic. The first step to grabbing enemy IDs is to grab the game objects. This variable will store all enemies found in our scene. Currently, it'll be empty. Let's run the following method: GameObject.findGameObjects with tagConstants.enemyTag. There are two things worth noting. For most of this course, we've been selecting a single game object. However, Unity provides a set of methods for selecting multiple game objects. The methods share similar names. The word object should be plural. If we were to remove the letter S from the name, this method would select a single game object. Be sure to use the plural form of the word. The second thing worth noting is the return value. If we hover our mouse over the method, the return value is an array of game objects. It's not a perfect return value. The SceneEnemies variable wants a list. There are two possible solutions. We can update our variable's type to an array. Alternatively, we can convert the array into a list. I prefer working with lists. They're much easier to work with. That's a personal preference. For this reason, we're going to convert the array into a list. Wrap the method with a method called SceneEnemies.addRange. The addRange method is available on all lists. This method accepts an array. The values from the array are added to the list. This is one solution for converting an array to a list. There are other solutions available, but I find this solution to be the simplest. After calling this method, the SceneEnemies variable should contain a list of all enemies in the scene. However, we're not interested in the game objects. We're trying to grab the enemy's IDs. Let's begin looping through the game objects to get the IDs. On the SceneEnemies variable, call the forEach method to start looping through the results. For this demonstration, we're going to use a lambda expression. It'll be quicker than defining a method. Also, the method is not going to contain a lot of code, so it shouldn't clutter the method. In the parameter list, add a parameter called SceneEnemy with the GameObject class as the type. The next step is to grab the enemy controller component. This component contains the ID of the enemy. Create a variable called enemyControllerComponent. Its type will be the enemyController class. Set the variable to the following value: SceneEnemy.getComponentEnemyController. After grabbing the component, the final step is to store the ID in the list. We can call the sceneNemyIDs.add method to add a new item to the list. Let's pass in the enemy controller component.enemyID variable. We've successfully stored the ID of the enemy in the Game Manager component. This information will help us verify which enemies should be alive or dead. Just to make sure, let's verify that the enemy's IDs are being stored. After the loop, print the sceneNemyIDs.count property. As we know, the count property is available on all lists. It'll keep track of the number of items in the current list. Let's head over to Unity to play the game. Currently, I'm playing the island scene. In the console, the number of enemies that get logged is 4. If you have more or fewer enemies, this list should accurately hold the correct number of enemies. We're ready to start checking for defeated enemies. Before ending this lecture, I'm going to remove the print statement from the start method. It's no longer necessary to count the enemies. This was just to verify that our code was working. In the next lecture, let's begin looping through the enemies after the player has entered the portal.